Hey, over the past weekend, G2 won DreamHack Malmo, and I thought it was a very enlightening event because it was the first event of the new season in CSGO. And the reason I think it's enlightening is because there are specific games or specific series or tournaments that I call canon moments or canon, I guess. And the whole point of naming it that way is that they're like key moments that kind of define either a critical strength or a critical failure or like a critical change in a player or team's mentality. So, for instance, Envyus versus NRG in I think it was 2015. Basically, that was right after Envyus had won the major, and then they played NRG, who was like I'd argue like a tier 3 team at the time, and NRG went to counter pit. One of their players, I think it was Peter, like broke his leg in turbulence or something weird, so they had to bring in Tabson as a stand-in. And then it was one of the strangest series because basically what happened was Envious force bought themselves to death. And the reason that I consider this like an important moment in like the Envious history, despite the fact that it was just like a round of 8 loss, it wasn't a very big tournament, and it's not really a tournament most people remember, is because it showed a critical weakness or a critical flaw in the like strategic ideology of that particular team, and then their inability to change it despite the fact that they were losing to a team I considered way below them, and just in terms of overall skill. Like, yeah, God B is a good leader, but like man for man, like form for form, like Envious had no reason to lose that, but they did. And then we look at it retrospectively and we see that's kind of like one of the first signals of, yeah, Envious is going to fucking fall, it's going to break, because they had this strategic ideology and that they weren't able to change it, or they weren't able to get the players to buy into it. It's a bit hard to tell from the outside, but it was pretty clear that they were unwilling to change with the times, and that eventually hurt them, and then that led to the eventual French shuffle that we have today. And the reason I think Malmo is like a similar moment or a similar event is because G2 had just lost at Krakow Major in the group stages, and it wasn't really a bad loss as much as it was like the Roosters had come home, or to roost, I guess, is because if you looked at 2017 throughout like the G2 throughout the G2 events they've been playing LAN after LAN, there were a few obvious problems I thought the G2 roster had. Just from looking at the outside, it's hard to tell, internal stuff. But the first obvious problem was the fact that just in terms of pure leadership, in terms of pure tactics, they were always going to be a step behind the top teams. I feel like Kerrigan, Glaive, Fallen, those are all top tier leaders just in terms of the pure tactical side they can call, whereas G2 have Shox, and Shox is very good at a very specific thing, which is calling around like himself or calling around like a star player, but there's like an extent, there's like a limit to that, limit to how far you can go with that. Like stuchiu is another example of that, where yeah, it's good, but it won't it won't get you to the top. So in which case, if you have that type of leader, you have to make it up in other areas. And then that was like one of the problems. The other problem was the fact that for whatever reason Shox wasn't calling around himself, so it basically made his like tactics technically worse, because I feel like Shox is is in terms of pure potential, I think he's easily the second best player on the G2 roster. I think Kenny S is obviously the best, but beyond that, yeah, Apex is great, MBK is great, Body is great, but if I have to pick one where it's like, okay, you want this guy to go off huge this game, I'd always pick Shox over the other. Actually, maybe not over Apex, just because when Apex goes off, it's like he automatically wins the T side for you. But in most general cases, Shox is like a huge impact player. He's the guy who's going to be winning impossible clutches. He's the guy who he can sometimes open up a entire round by himself, or he can like the versatility he has in his game and all the things he can do and the impact he brings is huge. So I always felt like this G2 was lacking that, despite because he, for whatever reason, didn't want to call around himself. So I thought that was another problem. And then the final problem is obviously the economy game. And the reason I call this a problem is because G2 didn't really respect the economy so much. And I understand the extent of that because, Happy broke the fucking game with his 4 spies. And all of them, to some level, all of them agree like all these players that are currently under G2 all agree on some implicit level that Happy was right. And Happy was right in a general sense. I think that force buys really are like an important facet to the game, and changing momentum and breaking people's economies. But the problem with G2 was they were doing it too much in situations that didn't call for it. So, for instance, they'd be up a bunch of rounds on their CT side, and then when they get to the CT side, they'd force buy, even though they only need like 1 or 2 rounds to close the game. And so it's like it'd be like a 14-8 scoreline, and then it'd run up all the way to the end to overtime because they'd force buy and then just lose out on the economy. So you're never getting the op into Kenny S's hands. You're never really getting all the nades you want. You're never getting the rifles, the weaponry, like the kits. All this good stuff that, if you just save for 1 or 2 rounds, you go into a round where you at worst have 50-50 odds. But in G2's case, I feel like if they actually got to a regular round without even with just like a single op, they don't need the double op setup, but the double op setup is pretty good. But if you went to this full buy round, like they actually have a much higher chance than just 50% just to close it out. And it'd be depending on the team, of course, but I always felt like they basically made it easier for the opposing teams to get back into the game because of their way they were handling their economy on CT side. And all these problems ended up biting them in the ass at the Krakow Major because they all popped up. Like Shox was nowhere to be seen. Their economy handling was pretty terrible. Like tactically speaking, like it wasn't necessarily bad, but wasn't good enough. And so they had to rely on skill, and then you're running into like a bunch of skill lineups. I remember, I think the final round was against Fnatic, and Fnatic's only win condition is skill. So I was like, they gave Fnatic a puncher's chance, even though I consider G2 a team above them. And that's why Fnatic got into the playoffs and G2 failed, I guess. So going to Malmo, it was like I was gonna think of it as a critical event until I saw G2 play. Now the reason for that is because G2 changed a bunch of things, whereas in most cases most teams don't. Like for instance, like Happy never did change, obviously. So Fnatic themselves, like they tried to change but they were unable to. There are a few other examples, but those are the like 2 prominent ones I can think of. Oh, NIP obviously, they never changed until they finally had to kick Freiburg. Like there are a bunch of problems like that, and so that's why I wasn't really expecting anything from G2. I just thought it'd be the same as before, where like the top 3 teams, Astralis, SK, FaZe, but right now FaZe is going through a roster shuffle, so you can't really expect them to reach that level until like 2 to 3 months from now. That's my time limit for them. Same thing with Navi. And then you have G2 who was below that, and G2 was like, I thought they'd go into this tournament with the same problems, so they'd have like a good chance against SK, but against the other teams it'd be more of a toss-up. But when you actually go into this tournament, they've changed a lot of things. Like for instance, they've decided to have Apex call Mirage, and then they've added that to their map pool. It's not really I don't consider it like a strong map for them, but it gives them more options in the map veto, and it gives them like a chance to win against better teams. And obviously this happened against SK when they played in the quarterfinals. So that was good. Most surprising, I guess, would be the fact that Shox is been put back into play, I guess. And that's actually a good thing for the G2 roster, because I feel like you need if you're always suffering, like if there's always going to be a small differential between your tactics and the tactics of somebody like Fallen or Kerrigan or Glaive, you need the extra firepower. You need that extra impact, the guy who will win the rounds you're not supposed to, and Shox is that guy for G2. So having him back more into play is a good thing for G2. And finally, if you watch the North versus G2 game 1 in the finals, that's when G2 go to the CT side. It was like it was a half unlike anything I'd seen from G2 up to this point, in the fact that they did play the numbers game, they did play the economy game, they did the full ecos, they got their gun rounds, and then they grinded out North, and there were just too many rounds to work with, and they eventually beat North on the CT side. So I thought that was really impressive. I thought, especially because like it's showing a level of change and adaptability that I didn't actually believe could show up in this roster or most rosters. Like a lot a lot of teams say they'll improve. A lot of teams say they'll change, but more often than not, like it's hard to change your fundamental ideas, your fundamental like strategies, your fundamental tactics, or your fundamental play style. So generally speaking, it's more likely that they won't change than they will. But I have to give credit to G2 here. They really did change everything, or not everything. They changed a bunch of the problems that were plaguing this roster before, and I feel like if this continues, they should be moving from like, all right, so before the major, there were obviously 3 top teams in the world: FaZe, SK, Astralis, and then right below them was G2, and then below that was everybody else. I feel like with these changes, G2 should be moving up to the top echelon and should be a consistent like championship contending team. The only question you have to have for FaZe is the fact that Apex basically went fucking crazy to beat SK, and yeah, that's obviously not going to happen every time, but I mean, if we just look at historical precedent and then just look at the way the games keep playing out, G2 does have some kind of weird edge against SK. So I think you can always like assume G2 should have some kind of favorable edge against SK, despite like how the map vetoes work out, where SK should have better maps. Kind of weird, but ignoring that, the other problem I guess would be Astralis. And Astralis, I feel like Astralis are more dangerous when they have more time to prepare. And yeah, they had more time to prepare than most other teams coming to this event. But what I mean by like prepare is they also have like more data on the other teams. And I feel like G2's new look, like not G2's new look would have like caught them off guard, or Gambit's change from like a more tactical style to Adren leading and then having Fitch coming in, like caught them a bit like off foot. But in general, I think Astralis was likely the most dangerous team for G2, especially when if Device does like the counter strategy like he usually does against like the star players. I feel like Device might be a problem for the G2 roster. Beyond that, like I said, FaZe, Na'Vi, they should take 2 to 3 months, like a minimum, just to reach that same level you would expect from them. I will say fucking Simple is dangerous as hell. Like there's no like, he might just auto win sometimes, but that's not really something they should be worried about at this moment. So I feel like going into the first 3 months of this offseason, I think G2 is going to be one of the top 3 teams next to SK and Astralis, and because they have the favorable matchup against SK, they should do better than SK. That's my guess anyway, but I mean, it'll really depend on how the brackets work out in the coming tournaments. So watch out for G2. They've really changed, and I think this is a good like sign for them going towards the future, and hopefully things work out. Later.